Hi, I'm Dr. Hale. This is ELED 3320, and in this video I want to talk to you about the third matching scheme for matching children to books. We've already talked about matching kids to books based on developmental information that we have observed. We've talked about matching kids to books based on what they're interested in. Now I want to talk about matching children with books based on grade level or readability. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is what's called Fry's readability formula. It is one of many readability formulas out there, and it is used to decide how difficult a book is. So when you look at books or when you look them up online, a lot, like on Amazon, it'll say grade level. So the way publishers determine that is by using a readability formula. It could be Fry's readability formula. That one is probably the oldest and the most well-known, or it could be another readability formula. And the way these readability formulas generally work is they count the words, the number of words, the number of syllables, and the number of words in sentences, and then they plot those answers on a chart. Okay, and if you scan either this QR code here, or if you click on this link at the bottom, it'll take you to what is called the Fry readability chart. Okay, so when a readability formula counts those things and they plot the answers on a chart, it tells you roughly what grade level the book is. Fry's readability level or formula goes all the way through the junior college level, so through sophomore year in college. The way those readabilities levels look, it kind of depends on which readability formula you're using. So Fry's, it's going to say something like 3.2, which means third grade, second month. 5.8, fifth grade, eighth month. That's how they generally read. Sometimes it will show up as grades 3 through 5 or ages 8 to 10. But know that publishers have used a readability formula to determine that. One of the most common leveling systems that we see these days is what's called a Lexile level. Lexile level. We get that when we get reading scores back on statewide assessments, and you can use that Lexile level to determine what books fall into that kid's readability range. Okay. So that's what I want you to know about readability formulas. We may look at some when we're together in class. Another thing we can do in terms of readability is administer what's called a cloze test. A cloze test can give you a general idea of a student's reading level. So what you do is you take a book that you're considering reading in class, or maybe your curriculum says that in the second 6 weeks, your class is going to read together the novel Hatchet. That's just an example. I always go to Hatchet. I'm not sure why. So what you do is you pull a 100-word excerpt from the book Hatchet. Doesn't have to start at the beginning of the sentence, doesn't have to end at the end of a sentence. You just lift out 100 words, type it up, and for every fifth word, you put a blank. For every fifth word, you leave out the word and you put a blank. And then you give this to students and you have them fill in the blanks. Okay? They fill in the blanks with the words that they think make sense. Once you score it, what matters is their percentage. So what you want to look for is these percentages. Let's say they score 93% or higher on this cloze test. What that tells you is that that text, in this case it would be Hatchet, is a book that they can read independently. That is their independent level. They don't need any help reading it. So you can look at the readability of that. Let's say it's a 4.2. So what that tells you is they can read a 4.2 independently. Okay? If they score between an 80 and a 92%, that tells you that that level text is at their instructional level. What that means is that book is ideal for classroom instruction. So if you're going to read it together as a class, or if you're going to read it together in guided reading groups or small group reading groups, that means they need a little bit of support with it. If they score less than 80 on that cloze test, that means that that book is at their frustration level and there is absolutely no reason for them to read it. Okay? Could be tears involved. Don't make them read that. It's just too difficult for them, even with help. So what you can do with these results, you can use them to figure out which texts in your classroom are appropriate for kids that they can read independently, which ones you can use in guided reading or whole class instruction, but they can also be used to help support you in discussing struggling readers with administrators. So let's say that you have a district curriculum that mandates that you use the book Hatchet with your fourth grade level class. And you create a cloze test with it, and you discover that for 40% of your students, Hatchet is at their frustration level of reading. So what you do is you go to your administrator, show them this data. Administrators love data, and help explain to them that Hatchet is not a good choice as a whole class novel in your classroom, that it would be more appropriate if you could find multiple novels and use them in guided reading instead of as a whole class novel. Okay, great kind of assessment data for you to have to share with your administrators. So this 3 strikes and you're out idea. We've talked about matching students to books based on developmental theories, matching students to books based on interest, and matching students to books based on readability. So I want you to keep in mind 3 strikes and you're out, just like in baseball. The reason I have this slide here is because kids are going to come to you for book recommendations. You're the book expert in the classroom. They're going to ask you to help them find a book that's a just right book for them. If they ask you 3 times for a recommendation and they don't like any of them, or they're too hard, or they're too easy, they're going to stop asking you, and you don't want that. You want kids to keep coming to you so you can keep scaffolding them, building them up to more and more complex texts, using what you know about their development, their interest, and their reading level, as well as what you know about the books. So the implication behind all of this is that you got to know your kids and you got to know your books. I can't stress that enough. Know your kids and know a lot of books. The last thing I want to talk about is a word about reading levels. So if you look at a book and it has RL on the back, or if you look at it on Amazon and it says grade level, that RL stands for reading level. So what I need you to know is that publishers are in the business of selling books. Their goal is to sell more books. So use some caution when you rely on their judgment of reading levels. They use a lot of different formulas to get what they want. What you need to understand is they're going to choose a reading level that is as wide as possible because that means they sell more books. Just because it has a low readability level doesn't mean it's a low reading level. Keep in mind, those reading levels don't take into account anything about the content of the book. It is only looking at words, syllables, number of words, and sentences. It looks at multisyllabic words. It doesn't look at what the story is about. Okay? So let's say, for example, there's a series of books called the Bluford books. They're aimed at low readers in middle and high school, but they have, because they have a very low readability. Okay, so their readability is like 2nd grade level, but the content of those books, pretty gritty. It's about what middle and high schoolers want to read about. You don't want to give that to a 2nd grade reader, so you always have to consider the content. Readability should not restrict what a child should read. Just because a book is at a low reading level doesn't mean they should automatically read it if they're in 2nd grade. Just because it's at a higher reading level doesn't mean they shouldn't read it if they're in 7th grade. Okay? We have to keep in mind content, interest, readability, development, all of those things. It's a lot of balls to keep in the air, to juggle, but that's our job as teachers when we're trying to match kids to books. Think about all of that. We'll talk about this more in class. Thanks for tuning in.